Hi, and welcome once again to Ivy English. I'm Karen.
I'm Chris Gorski.
Today is October 24th, and today we're going to talk about some organs people have called useless that may not actually be useless.
So the process of science is taking an idea and collecting evidence and building it into a theory where, based on what we understand right now, this is what we believe to be true. And good science means that eventually, with more evidence, these old ideas may be refined or made better, or they may be thrown out entirely. In the past, I'm sure you've heard of some of these things. Some organs, they don't really do anything. But as a matter of fact, with more evidence and a little more careful thought, scientists are reconsidering their position on these useless, quote-unquote, organs.
Right, and they're reconsidering their position on a lot of things, and I think it's high time because Chris and I just had a really interesting conversation about stuff they told us as kids that we knew at the time was total nonsense. For example, animals don't have feelings, they don't feel pain, they don't have a soul. I just never, ever bought into that. Anybody who has a pet, you know perfectly well, their emotions very much reflect our own.
Yeah, I agree. There were things as a kid, I would think, I'm like, there's no way this is true.
No.
I remember looking at books about what they knew about dinosaurs and various things. I remember them describing as a very matter-of-fact issue, this is the way dinosaur skin was. And I'm like, how do we know that? They didn't have imprints of their skin.
Right.
And we just have the bones. And of course, with further evidence, we today believe that many dinosaurs had feathers and they're the ancestors of birds and so on and so forth.
That's right.
This was not the case in the 80s. And I remember just looking at it and being like, come on, man, I know you don't know this.
That's right. And I think a lot of especially little boys love dinosaurs, but I never got into it because I thought we just don't know enough about them. How can I get obsessed with something when we're not sure what the heck they were like?
Yeah, I agree. I think but that is the process of science, isn't it? So we're just going to keep collecting evidence. We're going to move forward and we're going to update our conclusions, which is a good process for all humans, I think. Every once in a while, I'll run across a person who says, I know what my opinions are. I formed them whenever.
50 years ago.
You don't have any updated opinions based on your life experience?
Yeah. Views on many things have changed. So let's get back to what we're talking about today. We're talking about human organs that for a long time we've thought have no particular use or purpose. We're going to discuss that. Our title again, are these organs really useless? It's likely that you may know someone who has had their appendix removed, or at least you've heard of the operation. An appendectomy is typically performed when the appendix, a small pouch next to the intestines, becomes inflamed or infected, leading to severe pain and potential complications if left untreated. Fortunately, the procedure is very safe today, and patients can go on to live normal lives without their appendix. Yet, it still begs the question of how humans can continue living without an organ.
The human body is full of various parts that scientists still don't completely understand, and the appendix is one of the top examples. Such organs are often referred to as vestigial, a term first coined by German biologist Robert Wiedesheim in the 1890s. He used the term to describe structures in organisms that appear to have lost their original function but remain in the body. He identified 86 such structures, noting their diminished physiological significance.
Vestigial organs were also of great interest to Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory. He was one of the first to suggest that species change through natural selection and genetic drift, although these processes still aren't perfectly understood. There may be some vestiges that persist in species as they evolve, serving as evidence of evolutionary history.
Darwin was intrigued by the appendix and theorized that it might have originally helped process plants eaten by early humans. Recent research suggests that the appendix may play a role in both the immune system and digestive health, though its exact function remains uncertain. A leading theory proposes that the appendix acts as a reservoir for beneficial bacteria that help fight infections or diseases that may develop in the large intestine.
So this is only part one of a two-part article. We'll hear part two tomorrow when we're going to talk about another organ whose function we're not really sure of. Today we're going to talk about the appendix, and I have firsthand experience.
Oh, do tell.
I will when we get to it. Let's go through the article bit by bit, and when we get to the part about the appendix, then I have experiences to share. So are these organs really useless? It's likely that you may know someone who has had their appendix removed, or at least you've heard of the operation. When I read that, I thought, me, that happened to me. An appendectomy is typically performed when the appendix, a small pouch next to the intestines, becomes inflamed or infected, leading to severe pain and potential complications if left untreated. Now, that's the situation I was when I was about 19 years old. So this happened to me when I was an exchange student. I was in Hamburg, Germany, and I lived with a really wonderful family. The father was a doctor. And so when I said, I've got this pain in my lower right-hand side, and he said, we better go check this out. So under his guidance, I had a barium drink that I had to take, which will show up as a light portion when you take an x-ray. So you can see exactly what's in your intestine when you've taken this substance, because it will light up the parts that are unusual.
Is it injected or do you drink it?
I drink it.
What does it taste like?
It's chalky. It's chalky.
I was just thinking, I have no idea what this would taste like.
Sorry,
this is neither here nor there. I just needed to know.
Yeah, it's sort of like if you had a solution of clay.
Okay.
Yeah, and you drank it.
Interesting.
It's thick, though. It's quite thick. And I thought, And then it eventually has to come out.
Wow.
So after the procedure is done, you're going to poop out something very chalky.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I remember that. Okay, so I did go through this, and my German father says, well, let's go check that out. And then he took x-rays. He had x-rays taken. And then he says, it's not really clear. Apparently, you do have a very low-grade chronic infection of your appendix. He said, I don't know what we should do yet, but I think that you should just be careful of your diet for a while and see if it will heal on its own. This was towards the end of a 13-month stay in Germany. So I was still in Germany when this stuff still was kind of low-grade hurting. And I had to solve it when I went back to the States. And so they wrote a letter. My German host father was curious, so how did it come out? And I'll come back to that in a minute because I've already talked a lot about it. But yeah, it was checked out and there was something going on with it. But very often, if you have a problem with your appendix, you often have acute appendicitis, which means if you do not get it taken care of immediately, it can burst and you could die.
Yeah. So let's look at this word appendectomy. It ends in CTOMY, which is very common in medical terms. It means to cut out.
To cut something out, right?
Intestines is a Latin word for within, which is a good word because it's inside your body. Inflamed means something is swollen, and infected means you are affected with disease.
Right. So if you're inflamed, it's turning red and probably getting kind of hot. Fortunately, the procedure is very safe today, and patients can go on to live normal lives without their appendix. Okay, so I've made it many decades since then. When I got home, my sister is also a health professional, and I told her about it. She says, let's get this taken care of. And very quickly, she set up an operation, so I had it removed almost immediately after I got back, which surprised my German host father. He thought, well, aren't you going to observe it longer and see if blah, blah, blah? And no, they just decided to take care of it so we wouldn't have to keep worrying about it. And I have to say that the stitches were really coarse, and I could show you my tummy here, and you would see there's still a very clear scar where I had it removed. And it hurt and bled for a while, but it was fine after that. I eventually healed. But I have another addition to the story for later that happened in Taipei. So yeah, apparently life goes back to normal. You are missing an organ, which you don't really miss, you don't notice, but you've got a scar on your tummy. Okay, next sentence. Yet, it still begs the question of how humans can continue living without an organ. So I will just append the little story that came after that. So quite a few years ago, I had this pain in my lower right side. And it continued for a long time, and I had no idea what it was. I thought maybe it's a female problem, but it wasn't quite in the right place for a female problem, like ovaries or something like that, because we've had that in our family. And I was just curious. It wasn't debilitating, but it was distracting because it hurt. So I went to Taiwan University Hospital, and they gave me a really thorough check with all the modern machines, which was painful. I had to drink stuff for those too. And after these days of tests, and they looked at the results, they said, we don't see anything wrong. And so eventually it sort of went away. And it came back a few years later, bugged me for a while, and then eventually sort of went away. But I believe it comes sort of when I'm stressed out.
I could see
Stress will
that.
bring it on. And I believe it probably is an after effect of the appendectomy. That's what I believe.
That's interesting. I could see that. Stress and disease are definitely related, right? And you've had evidence of this happening in the past. It seems logical to me that this could be a true cause.
Right. So the stress is kind of targeting a part of me that's weakened because of the operation, and it's missing. So that's my story of my appendectomy.
Let's look at this phrase, begs the question. This means when we talk about something, it raises an obvious question. It kind of naturally follows along. It's a fairly common phrase in English.
Right. That begs the question of, it's implying that, there's something that you haven't really told us here that's kind of important.
All right, let's learn a little bit more in our next paragraph. The human body is full of various parts that scientists still don't completely understand, and the appendix is one of the top examples. And sure enough, as a child, I always heard that the appendix was just there. It didn't do anything.
Okay, I have a little bit to add on here. So when I was still with my host family in Hamburg, with my German father kind of overseeing things, he was explaining to me what we believe the appendix is for. And so he just took a pen and paper. He says, here is your intestine, and here is what the appendix probably originally was. It was a whole side alley, a blind alley, where food was sent to be further processed when we were eating a lot of cellulose, a lot of fiber, a lot of plant foods that you can't really digest cellulose. So it would go into maybe this large kind of side alley and try to further digest it. But then our diet changed. We didn't need it. And so the organ just kind of shrunk.
So modern apes that still continue to eat raw, very cellulose-heavy foods still also have appendices, and their appendices are still full functioning, although there are examples in all throughout the animal kingdom of various organs and structures that are no longer especially useful for them. If we have time, we'll talk about them.
Okay, and I can give you a hard word related to what I just said, atrophy. And it means for something to shrink because it's not being used anymore. It's spelled atrophy. Atrophy. That PH tells you already that it's from Greek. So it just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks because it's not serving a purpose anymore.
All right, let's continue here. Such organs are often referred to as vestigial, a term first coined by German biologist Robert Wiedesheim in the 1890s.
Now, a vestige is something that's left behind. So maybe the thing went away, but it left some kind of part of itself or some kind of sign of itself behind.
Vestige or vestigial is Latin for the word footprint. So a footprint is not a foot. There used to be a foot there, but it's gone, and we can see its imprint there, but the foot is no longer there, therefore there's no use. So kind of vestigial, the term is kind of suggesting that we're not really using this anymore.
Yeah, you left a trace of something behind.
He used the term to describe structures in organisms that appear to have lost their original function but remain in the body. But our next sentence is really important because the way people commonly understand vestigial organs or vestigial structures is kind of that, okay, we don't use this at all anymore, but realistically, scientists have a more complicated, more nuanced understanding of vestigial structures.
They kind of remind us of our history.
So he identified 86 such structures, noting their diminished physiological significance. So the pop understanding is here are these things we don't use anymore. We don't use our appendix at all anymore. But just as Karen pointed out, well, here's this thing that maybe is not really a primary or main role in our body anymore, but it's not like it's just doing nothing. So our German biologist, Robert Wiedesheim, is saying, hey, here are things that are diminished. They're not as useful as before, but they're not necessarily totally useless.
Exactly, yeah. And actually, I can feel my former appendix kind of calling out now. It's still there.
So he identified 86 such structures. Some of them were nipples on men, your tonsils, nodes or points on your ears, which, Karen, we learned that you have.
I have. Yeah.
And your wisdom teeth, which we'll talk about a lot tomorrow. Now, today we understand tonsils also kind of have other functions and stuff, but that's kind of the point of this. They're diminished. Now, when I think about 86 vestigial organs, I like things like nipples on men and tonsils. I also think this is probably the worst Baskin-Robbins I've ever been to.
What does that mean?
So Baskin-Robbins is 31 flavors.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, yeah. So for tonsils especially, it was very common when I was young that if kids got a lot of colds and infections, they would remove their tonsils. But they later stopped doing that because they found that they probably play a role in immunity. They help keep you healthier, less likely to get a serious disease.
Anytime a doctor looks into my throat, every single doctor I look at says, why are your tonsils so big and so scarred? I used to have terrible infections through my tonsils all the time, and they have these huge holes in them. And the doctor's like, why didn't you get those taken out? And I have to explain because I'm American and I didn't have health insurance. So I just have these horrible enlarged tonsils in my throat, which probably is the reason my voice has this weird characteristic to it.
Oh, it's a great voice, but it was probably wise to keep them in spite of all the problems. It's better to keep them there when you can. Our next paragraph. Vestigial organs were also of great interest to Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory. So a lot of people will kind of ignore the exceptions or the blips in the screen or things that are a little bit out of the mainstream. But my mentor in my PhD program, he said the exceptions are as important as the examples that follow the rules or the mainstream. So whenever you find these things, you should look into it because you'll probably learn a lot of interesting stuff.
Okay, so let's just plant our flag right here and point out that a theory is not just some idea without evidence. When we talk about theories in the scientific sense, the scientific definition of a theory, this means we have a lot of evidence. We have studied and researched and reached certain conclusions based on this evidence. This isn't just some idea, and because it's a theory, we can't observe it or it hasn't been proven. The word theory in everyday English just means a good idea, but maybe we're wrong. But a theory, when we use it in science, is very close to a conclusive fact.
But very often we find they're wrong.
People will get very, very sweaty about this word theory. Please pay attention. Are we using this in an accurate scientific fashion or an everyday kind of colloquial sense?
And it's a way to stay humble. You can say, I have this theory, which means I've thought about this and I'm thinking this is a possibility, but I might be wrong. He was one of the first to suggest that species change through natural selection and genetic drift, although these processes still aren't perfectly understood, and that's true. And the problem is that this gets mixed up with religion and politics.
Yeah, you would be surprised if you really were to dive in of the after effects of what Darwin was looking for. It leads to some very dark corners of history because, well, if we're survival of the fittest and natural selection, then some must be better than others. And if you have an improper understanding of the way this works, you can say, well, therefore, these people are better than them. And of course, this idea was used in World War II to very, very detrimental effects to many millions of people.
And from the beginning, Darwin was viciously attacked for not believing in God or for negating God. There may be some vestiges that persist in species as they evolve, serving as evidence of evolutionary history. Okay, all of this is kind of heavy. So natural selection means things that are most appropriate and helpful to survival will tend to survive in the being. And genetic drift, that means once you have something that helps you survive better, you're going to have progeny. You're going to have kids, and their kids will also have this same trait. The people who don't have it might not survive. And so we don't understand this perfectly, but it seems pretty much the way things work. And then maybe something still exists in our body that came along in our evolution, and maybe it had a purpose at some time, but now it has less of a purpose. It does, however, tell us something about our history as biological beings.
So other animals also have vestigial organs. For example, beetles, some beetles have wings, but they can't fly. Of course, we have flightless birds like penguins. There are catfish that live underground and have never seen the sunlight and don't have functional eyes, but the eyes are still there. Whales have pelvis and hind limbs. Pythons have pelvic spurs. That used to be their legs. And there is one big toe on a horse that they run on. That's their hoof. It's one toe. They don't have a need for 5 toes. These are all vestigial remaining structures. They're not completely useless, but they are diminished from their original role.
Okay, let's move on to our last paragraph.
Darwin was intrigued by the appendix and theorized that it might have originally helped process plants eaten by early humans.
Which is exactly what my German host father, told me with his drawing. It's exactly what he said.
When we are intrigued by something, we are fascinated, we are interested by it, and remember, a theory is not just an idea, there is evidence collected here. Recent research suggests that the appendix may play a role in both the immune system and digestive health, though its exact function remains uncertain.
That seems to be a theme that we keep coming back to. Whenever there's an organ, we think, oh, it wouldn't matter if we didn't have that. It doesn't have a function. They often cite that it may play a role in immunity.
Your immune system is the system in your body that fights disease, germs, and bacteria. Your digestive system helps process food so you can get nutrition. And let's continue. A leading theory proposes that the appendix acts as a reservoir for beneficial bacteria that help fight infections or diseases that may develop in the large intestine.
So that sounds very plausible to me. So if it doesn't have any obvious purpose, maybe it is keeping some bacteria there that are good bacteria that help us in various ways like fighting infection.
When we look at the word beneficial, we could see B-E-N-E, which is Italian and Latin and Spanish and a whole lot of languages for good. So when we see this word beneficial, we can very obviously see these are the good germs that exist in our gut.
And earlier in the month with Teacher Wesley, we noted that if there are 2 R's in a word separated from each other, we often don't pronounce the first one. For example, surprise. We don't usually say surprise. We say surprise. And we usually say caterpillar. We don't say caterpillar. And you notice that reservoir, we often say reservoir. We don't pronounce the first R.
So for tomorrow, we will be talking about the wisdom teeth. And I think, Karen, you told us that we have quite a story in hand for tomorrow.
That's right. A very bloody story that I will share with you tomorrow. Make sure that you tune in then. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.